Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce you now to the panel that is going to focus on, in fact, pedagogy. We spend a lot of time on campus thinking about how to help students achieve their aspirations. Many have aspirations for public service. The discussion here will be about that question, preparing for public service. And it will be moderated by our colleague at the center, Chris Robichaud. Chris has a PhD in philosophy from MIT and is a senior lecturer in the Kennedy School who's made a name for himself reinventing ethics pedagogy at Harvard. So you're all going to get the Robichaud experience as a part of this session. And we have, I'm delighted to say, recently been able to convince Chris to join us at the center as the center's director of pedagogic innovation. We're in the midst of re-engaging with the curriculum around campus. The undergraduate college is redoing the general education curriculum again, and we're working hard to support that, the courses in ethics and civics, and there's also work going on in all the other schools on campus. And so Chris is helping us think a lot about the directions of that work. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. So today's session is going to be divided into two parts. The first portion of it is a wonderful conversation with these three panelists, who I will briefly introduce in a moment. And then we're going to immediately pivot and switch gears and run ourselves through a portion of one of the simulations that I've put together to help teach policy students a little bit about ethics, applied ethics in the political arena. And so I'm going to subject you, I guess this is the Robichaud experience, I'm going to subject you to that. And then there'll be time after that for tears. And that was my best joke. Wow. Moral, I was going to say tears, moral judgment, et cetera, confession, and so forth afterwards. So I'm going to start at my far left, your far right. We are delighted to have Larry Lessig here joining us. Larry Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at the Harvard Law School, and of course, former director of the Saffer Center for Ethics. He has done a tremendous amount of work in the public domain promoting ethics and has focused a good portion of his attention on the role of political corruption in the American Congress, including founding an organization called Root Strikers and running for President of the United States the last election cycle on a platform that was designed to help address money in politics. So if you would please join me in welcoming him. Seated next to him, we have Yuli Tamir. Yuli Tamir was the former education minister of Israel and head of the Association for Civil Rights. She's received her doctorate in political philosophy from Oxford and has written extensively in this area, including an underappreciated but fantastic book, I believe, on liberal nationalism, something that is more relevant now than ever before. If you'd please join me in welcoming Yuli. Thank you very much. And last, we have Richard Painter. Richard Painter is currently the S. Walter Richley Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota Law School, and he received his J.D. from Yale University. He served for several years as the chief ethics lawyer for the George W. Bush administration, and recently has reappeared in the news, which we will talk about in a little bit. If you please welcome Richard for me. So our topic is preparing for public office, and we're at a time when a lot of people are invigorated to join. And by that I mean many people are now considering running for office who may never have considered it before. We have more and more people taking to the streets as well. There's a lot of interest in political activity. Larry, I wanted to begin with you. You decided to run for president of the United States, and you did so with a singular vision of what you wanted to address, and what you wanted to address had a very clear ethical component. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to make that run, and what are some of the things you learned, especially from the moral standpoint, along the way?
Well, one of the things I learned is that whenever you're asked a question, you ignore the question you are asked, and you answer the question you want to answer. It's not a great strategy for students taking an exam, but it turns out to be that. So I'm going to twist this a little bit, because what I was surprised to be put on this panel, because I think that we have to accept there's a distinction between people who are entering a well-functioning political system. Running for legislature in Vermont or running for parliament in Sweden. I mean, these are, well-functioning political systems, and you play your role as a Democrat, or you play your role as a Republican, and the nature of what you're doing is very specific and happy. Versus people trying to participate in a political system that they believe is failed, deeply flawed. And the very act of trying to participate is incredibly difficult in the context of criticizing that flawed system. So in my view, that's where we are in America. We have a deeply failed political system right now. It's manifesting itself in all sorts of ways that I think is actually symptoms of of a deeper problem. But whatever the reason is, it's very hard to focus the political energy of politicians on the real problem. So when I thought of running, it wasn't that I was thinking about how to become president. Right? Not that crazy. Right? What I was thinking about was how to enter the race in a way that gave me the opportunity to force the political candidates to address a system an issue which they systematically just wanted to ignore. And we thought there was a pretty easy way to do that. It looked like the debates were accessible until they changed the rules for getting into the debates so that it no longer was accessible. But so that's not how to prepare for office. That's how to jigger the system, or at least try to do something to the system to get the system to focus on this underlying problem. And my friend Richard Painter, is obviously playing a similar kind of role. I mean, he's a Republican, but he's not playing a role as like a loyal Republican in the system right now. What he's doing is party man in the system. What he's doing is trying to, in some sense, stand above the system or allow the message that he's uttering to, in some sense, not play into the partisan division or just problems of this existing system. So that's a way of saying, I tried to do something, but I don't know that what I tried to do is exactly what you asked.
If I can just have a quick follow-up on that, though. I mean, given your own description of your reasons for entering the race, then, I mean, do you think there was something morally interesting, maybe even morally problematic about it, in that it seems like you were running for president, but not really?
Well, no. I mean, I was really running for president.
Okay.
And when Bernie Sanders entered the race, it's not like Bernie Sanders thought he was going to be the president of the United States. He entered the race explicitly saying, I mean, I was part of the people talking to him when he was doing this was, I'm going to get this message out there. We're going to get a progressive message out there and make that part of the debate. And I think this is a legitimate role in politics. You don't have to believe you're going to certainly win to believe that the position you want to advance is an essential position that needs to be advanced, especially when there seems to be a political market failure in addressing the system in the way that I think that it needs to be addressed. And so I think that played out. You saw corruption as a central part of this political campaign, but it was only ever used to beat up another political candidate. So Bernie used the issue to beat up Hillary, and then Donald Trump picked up the issue to beat up Hillary. And we didn't see anybody really talking about the issue in a way to direct America to what would be a solution. For example, Richard's book right there offers a pretty good solution to this problem, but that was never part of the conversation because it doesn't pay to talk about it like that. So in some sense, I wanted to fill a political market failure gap by stepping in and talking about it in a way that they otherwise wouldn't be talking about it, and hopefully change the course of that debate.
Right, thank you. Yuli, when I think about preparing students from an ethics standpoint for public service, there's what I would describe as the low-hanging fruit that you don't want. You want people to be well-prepared, never to engage in. Don't sling racial slurs around, don't steal, don't engage in sexual harassment. Obvious stuff. But then there's this whole realm of morally gray areas, like really hard issues that reasonable people can reasonably disagree about in public office. What do you think are some good ways to get people who are preparing for public office to think about those scenarios? And what, from your own experiences, have you learned about confronting them?
Well, I'll go halfway your way, halfway his way. I think that, first of all, it's very hard to prepare people for public office because unfortunately, people who were with me here would admit that was my view even then, the gap between our discussions and what really happens in public life is enormous. That's the first thing you learn, right? You go into office, you have all these, articles you have sort of either written or read, and then you have to make a decision, and it never looks like anything you've seen before. And then the preparation, I think, is rather trivial. It's having the ability to analyze the situation in a critical way, having the decency to say what you don't know, which is actually a very difficult part of the political discourse, because I can't remember a politician saying, well, that is actually something I really don't understand. And the way the public would react to politicians like that would be, I think, quite horrendous. People want politicians to answer every silly question they have in mind, even though, why would I know as the Minister of Education something about drilling oil? But if you're a member of the government, you have to answer all these questions. And if you have, or you choose not to vote, people think it's irresponsible. So I think there is a lot of educational work to do, not so much for the candidates, but for the public. I think the public diminishes the way the politicians can act by raising the expectations that they would have something to say about everything, that they would be intelligent when they say something about everything. There is a strong sense in which the way we review politics, and I'm not speaking about the Trump era, I think it's a mistake to see this as something that represents the whole political process that we are, or the whole failure of the political process that we are witnessing. The public doesn't encourage politicians to do what we think politicians should do when we teach them how to do politics. So we tell people that they should think in a systematic way. They should make plans for the long term, that they should be sort of mild in their position, try not to create controversy, try to find a middle way. We give all these advices. If you follow them, you're going to be out of politics in a very short time, because none of them is highly evaluated or seen as a virtue by the public. The public wants quick answer, the public wants certainty, slogans. There's no rating for real solutions. There's certainly no ratings for long-term solutions. And therefore, it's very hard to prepare people for politics, because everything you teach them in order to do the right thing is going to fail them as politicians. I had the good luck that I was a sort of unusual kind of politician. I came from the academic world. I had somewhere to go to if I wished to end my political career, which I did. And I was not as much dependent on the public opinion and could have done some very controversial things. But there is an enormous price for that. And maybe the best thing you can teach people to do is how to cope with the enormous personal price that you pay for doing the right thing. We all sit in this room and we have this assumption that if you do the right thing, you're rewarded. But in politics, usually when you do the right thing, you're penalized. So learning to live with that is quite, I think, a difficult thing, and you have to allow people to somehow separate between their own evaluation of what they're doing and the public reception of what they're doing. And then maybe you get some more courageous politicians ready to do the right thing in the right moment.
That's a very sobering response, and there's a lot there to...
As Zig said, I'm a bureaucrat. Yeah. Which, by the way, if you have to, I should tell you, when I graduated at Oxford, I was so impressed by the fact that the provost of the university told us that we should go into public service. We just graduated at Oxford. We thought we're all geniuses, And he said, you're here to service your country. And many years later, when I became, not a bureaucrat, but I became part of the government, and I saw myself as a bureaucrat, and I think it was important that I saw myself. I thought how odd it is that people think that it is humiliating to be a bureaucrat. And that's a big failure of democracy, because if good people are not ready to be bureaucrats, you're never going to have good governments.
I want to circle back around in a bit on the second part of what you mentioned, which is, how you're not rewarded for doing the right thing and how we should prepare people to absorb the cost of that. But something that you mentioned earlier on, I do some work on the role of truth and knowledge in the public arena. It's been a very busy time. And the Shorenstein Center here just recently hosted a conference on fake news. You were suggesting earlier that part of this is the public's responsibility. The public has exaggerated expectations of the knowledge that public servants have. So we ask you to know everything about everything, and of course you can't. So Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, gives us a story of BS that's grounded in just this idea. He says the reason why there is so much humbug out in the public is precisely because of this. We are making too much demands on our public officials, and so they are encouraged to just make things up, whether they're right or wrong. Do you agree with that diagnosis?
Absolutely. I think Harry is absolutely right about it. I'll give you an example. I did a huge school reform. Israel invested over 11 billion shekels in a school reform. And when we had to pass it in the parliament, because it's an enormous amount of money, the prime minister came first. And, prime minister always grabs the achievements of the ministers. So he was presenting it. And he came and said, after this, Israel is going to be one of the best education systems in the world. We're going to be ranked on all the international tests very up, high, I don't know, 5th or 4th place. We're going to go and close economic gaps. And he had this list, wonderful list of things that we're going to do. And then I had the role of coming up and saying, well, actually, we won't be doing that. We're going to do something very specific with this money. We're going to double teachers' salaries, which I think is enormously important. However, it's not going to close social economic gaps. It's not going to change our ranking internationally. It's not going to do this and that and that and that. And there was a big debate at the House. Everybody said, so for that we're paying? And I said, well, you're paying for honesty, because that's what we're going to do. And we're going to achieve exactly what we said we're going to achieve. But there will be no disappointment, and there will be no, exaggerated hopes. And that, I think, is partly what we have politics. It's not only the politicians, it's us as a public. We have to educate ourselves to do, because all these things that people are promising, right, left, Trump, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, whoever, is completely disconnected from what they can do. But no one votes for somebody who says, I know how to do 2 little steps that will improve somehow inequality. That's not a slogan. That's not a political discourse, right? So we're doomed, because we're talking the wrong language. We're making inflated promises and inflated expectations. So everything seems then not working. People say the system doesn't work. It doesn't work because you promised that it will do things that it can't do. But it does do some other things that, are reasonable. So our all political judgment is totally distorted at the moment. Again, in the field of education, I think it's the worst. People promise that, Barack Obama would say, if every child would get a college degree, we will be fighting poverty. On the contrary, if every child will get a university degree, there will be a lot of people with a degree that are very poor. Stop making promises. I mean, that's the main thing that we should try to stop. But this is not, it's not something a politician can do on their own. That's supposed to be a much more, comprehensive move in order to make, I don't know if corruption, but decency in public life is really needed, and that is not something one person can do on their own.
Richard, speaking of decency, you were the main ethics lawyer for President Bush. Share with us some of your experiences about what were some of the challenging ethical dilemmas that you were a part of as an illustration of what some people might have to prepare for in positions of power in government.
Well, most of what I did in the Bush White House was dealing with the financial conflicts of interest of people coming into government in the cabinet positions, into the White House. Anyone who was Senate confirmed had to come to my office and talk to me about their financial conflicts of interest. And I would explain to them how important it was, for example, if you're going to be Treasury Secretary, you cannot own Goldman Sachs stock. I felt very bad for Hank Paulson to break the very unfortunate news to him that he had to sell all $600 million worth of Goldman Sachs stock.
But he didn't have to pay taxes on it.
And I, of course, immediately told him that we could get him a tax deferral of his capital gains tax through a so-called certificate of divestiture from the Office of Government Ethics and save him the $60 million. And selling Goldman Sachs stock in 2006 wasn't necessarily the worst move. It was a lot better than selling in 2008, which is, of course, why the president was bringing him in there, because I think people sensed that things were getting a little ahead on Wall Street. But a lot of it was financial conflicts of interest. At least I could say that the president of the United States himself has observed financial conflicts of interest rules by disclosing everything, including his tax returns, and also has eliminated business holdings that create conflicts of interest, including his interest in the Texas Rangers and so forth. That's certainly not true of our current president. I have to say, though, the one thing I learned in government service is how important people are to ethical decision-making. Ethical decisions in government have an enormous impact on people. And I would recommend to everyone a book written by my co-author, John T. Noonan, just passed away about less than 2 weeks ago. Judge Noonan wrote a book called Persons and Masks of the Law. And he emphasized, don't just look at the abstract principles in law. Look at the people who are affected by the decisions and what you do and your ethical decision-making. And that's something I learned in the White House, that there were decisions being made that were outside of my control, whether it's the decision to go into Iraq or other decisions that have an impact on people. And think about what happens to real people because of your ethical decision-making. I heard a discussion this morning about aggregation principles. It sounded very interesting and abstract, but I heard the discussion about children in a playground, and how do you weigh that against saving one life in a hospital of an elderly person? I think if you're going to go into politics, you need to move from the abstract and think about the real impact on real people. Who are those children? They're not my children who are going to play in a nice big backyard in an upper middle class suburb. They're in my town, probably North Minneapolis, predominantly African American, poor kids. We don't give them the park, there are going to be consequences. I mean, think about when we make decisions, it's not just abstract theory the way it may be in the university. There are people impacted when we make these decisions about trade-offs, whether to spend the money on the park, and the playtime for the children, and when we don't, what the consequences are for the community and for our future. Another example, President Trump said, well, the president can't have a conflict of interest. False. Well, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson always went back to their plantations. And they go back from the White House back to their plantations. Well, there's a lot that I admire about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but it's not those plantations. There were people living on those plantations. Conflicts of interest have consequences for real people. This is not just abstract theory. There are real people who are impacted by conflicts of interest. That financial conflict of interest of our early presidents, particularly our first and our third president, and many members of the Senate and the House, and the drafters of the Constitution had severe repercussions for our country that we paid a price for. With the Civil War, we're still paying the price for that. Real people impacted by conflicts of interest. This is not just abstract theory anymore. And that's what I hope people can understand when they go into government, that there are people who are affected by the decisions that are made in government. A lot of people who feel completely disconnected because they don't have a voice in choosing their leaders. And that's why I wrote this book on campaign finance, trying to reach out to people who are a lot more conservative than I am politically, but who I've worked with, trying to explain to them, look, we're all losers in a political system where a tiny, tiny fraction of the people are getting to choose the candidates and the ultimate victors in both parties. Real people are being impacted by what happens in our government. And more people getting angry because there's a complete disconnect And that's what we need to address. And I hope that young people going to public office can focus on that. I'll tell you your advice. What was it? If you want to go into public, I used to tell my kids this: if you want to go into public office, you shouldn't lie, cheat, or steal. Certainly don't commit sexual harassment or boast about it. And don't use racial slurs. Well, the first Wednesday in November, my kids are looking at me like, what? I'm going to tell my daughter, don't put your feet on the couch. And say, oh, but Kellyanne, I mean, what is going on in Washington? This is not encouraging at all.
So let me follow up on that briefly. I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here, but what do you think might be the longer-term consequences for Americans seeing a president who seems, I mean, and you recently sued him, who seems to flout a lot of ethical norms, whether they're captured by the law or not? Is this? I mean, you're talking about your own family. Let's move out from there.
Well, I tell my 12-year-old son that when I was 12, I watched the television and President Richard Nixon resigning, and that the presidents who have this attitude toward the law, the ethics rules don't apply to me, can have a very unpleasant end. And I think President Trump has a short period of time to understand the importance of the job. He has taken this job upon himself voluntarily. The American people, or the Electoral College or whatever, chose him for this position. He has it, and that he is going to be expected to adhere to the ethical norms of a public servant, or we're going to have to dispense with him. I mean, he needs to get that message, and we're going to take this very seriously. In the 2018 elections, members of the House and Senate who are not willing to hold the president accountable are going to have to be held accountable by the voters. The public is responsible. We don't just sit back and say, well, it's all Donald Trump's fault. We're going to have to do something. And as citizens, we have to do something. We cannot tolerate anybody in public service who is going to openly engage in conflicts of interest of this sort. I think it's unacceptable.
I'm going to open this up to questions shortly, but I just wanted to ask one more question for everyone. And Larry, I'm going to start with you in answering it. There are a lot of folks, and certainly some students, and this is to build off of something that Yuli said earlier, who say, I don't want a career in public service. In particular, I don't want to run for public office. Let me put that. I don't want to run for public office because I'm going to have to compromise too many of my core ethical values. I've got strong moral principles. I have strong moral values. And who wants a career in a bureaucracy where it sure seems to me as though I'm going to be compromising those all the time? It seems like this would be unfortunate because we take a lot of really good people and get them not running for office, not wanting to enter the bureaucracy. What can we say to these folks?
Well, I think there's two kind of compromises. One that I think is really debilitating, and one which is the nature of democracy. The one that's debilitating is the one that Richard is writing about and that I've written about, the one that, you know, when you spend 30 to 70% of your time raising money to run for Congress from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, you can't help but become sensitized to the issues that they care about and can't help but recognize that that's leading you in a way inconsistent with what you would do if you were actually being representative. That's a compromise that I think we ought to tear out of the system and find a way to eliminate. But there's another kind of compromise, which it's striking that we've just kind of forgotten in a democracy, right? A democracy is an institution where people who have very different views learn to live with each other and decide on issues. Like the idea that, you know, you come to Congress and you have a militant opposition party the way you might in a parliament, whose job it is to stop anything the other side wants to do, or that one side believes that they can, you know, pass only the things that they want without thinking about the other side, is a failure of the idea of democracy. In that sense, I think, you know, you go to Congress, you should say to yourself, here are my views, here are my values. I'm not going to compromise on certain values. I'm not going to give up things that are at my core, but I've got to understand that I've got to work with that guy and that woman, and I've got to find a way to govern that recognizes that not everybody's like me. And what that means is we've got to find a way to move to a place that none of us occupy naturally. That is the process. Yet what's striking is that it's a kind of post-Reagan thing. I think Reagan really framed it in this way to make it impossible for people to talk about politics as if it was something that you should be, quote, compromising about, as if that's a sin. But I think striking the way we don't have that frame anymore. And I think that's the essential part of democracy.
Really?
Well, the first thing I did before I went into office, I read Dennis's piece on dirty hands. Because it's much worse than that. Compromising is fine. I mean, that's politics. In Israel, that when you have a coalition government, that's actually the norm. Yeah. The thing you have to realize that when you're in office, again, in Israel, the cabinet is a collective entity. You are responsible for everything that is done in the name of the cabinet. And you make decisions that you hate yourself for making, and then you have to decide when you opt out. I had a moment I opt out, but before that, I took many decisions I was horrified with. There were wars. You know, I heard the talk yesterday, and I said, well, it doesn't really work this way in real life. The uncertainties are enormous. You have 2 minutes to decide, are you knocking down some Hezbollah guy in the northern south of Lebanon or not? The debate is interesting, but it lasts a minute and a half. When I was in America, my girls used to love this movie, President in Love. You remember that? Annette Bening and who's the guy? Michael Douglas. And I had teenage daughters. We used to watch it every evening, and then there's this, all this romance and thing. And then at the end, there is a moment when somebody calls into the Oval Room, and they have to decide whether to bomb Libya. And then, they have 2 minutes debate, and he says, yes, go for it. And the guy says to him, Mr. President, that was your most presidential moment. And I used to say to my daughter, look, romance doesn't look that way. But decision-making, that's the way it goes. 2 minutes. Because there are clouds, there are missiles, there are people on the ground. You have to make a decision. You don't actually can really appreciate the conversation, and your hands are often dirty. If you can't, this is really the one thing that at the high-level politics, if you can't bear that, you cannot be there. Because you're bound to be in this situation. You try not to cross the line, and it's a very difficult question when you think you crossed the line. Very difficult.
Richard?
Well, it's a world in which, of course, we have to compromise. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that because we're not always right. I'm certainly not always right. And having other people have other opinions is what democracy is all about. In a Republican form of government, you compromise within the legislative body. The question is, why are people making the decisions they are? Is it because they really feel that what they're doing is right, or because they are dependent upon some special interest that's giving them the money they need for their campaign, or some other dependency relationship? So when we sit down and say, well, what are our concerns about global warming, are those who are saying, well, we don't really need to worry about it, do they really believe that? Or is that because somebody's bankrolling the campaign? Who will pull the plug and support someone else who will primary them, get them out of there if they don't toe the line. Why are we making the decisions we are? We're not always right. I'm certainly not. But I would hope, if I entered public service, not to be beholden to somebody else simply because they're bankrolling me. I'd rather serve one term and say what I thought was right, and I might be wrong, but say what I thought was right, and then walk away from it. And that's the problem in the United States, is that too many of our public servants are dependent upon outside money, not just to their campaigns, but these 501c4 groups, these issue ad groups, Citizen United type operations, and then the super PACs, and it goes on. And if you're a career politician, you're dependent on these people to keep your job. And you don't toe the line, you don't do what they want, even if you know it's wrong, you're out of there. And that's the problem. We have a serious compromise of the integrity of our system because we've allowed money to buy influence openly, notoriously, under the constitutional protection of the United States Supreme Court. And this is, say once again, I think what's making ordinary people absolutely disgusted with the system.
Let's have some questions for the next 10, 15 minutes. So I'll call on you when you raise your hand. Who wants to start us off? Am I saying something? Did I see a hand over there? Here. There's a microphone coming around if we can hear.
Hi. So I'm interested in the notion of moral offloading. You see this talked about in wartime, how the way we conduct war, ordinary citizens are kind of offloading hard moral decisions onto the soldiers, who then have to bear the burden and responsibility of making the tough moral decisions. I was wondering if you thought something similar might hold in politics, the way we run, the way politics are run, and do you think that has any bearing on whether or not people should decide to go into politics? Do you think there might be a prima facie duty in light of the fact that all these tough moral decisions have to be made and we're just offloading it to our politicians?
Does anyone want to start with that?
I'm not so sure that I'm as troubled by the offloading in that context, as long as the constraint Richard was describing obtains. So if you're, in some sense, this is what we hire them for, to make certain kinds of decisions. And if they're making the decisions with the right kind of dependence and responding to the right kind of values, I think that's fine. I mean, that's part of what we want to do. Now, not every moral decision, obviously, some that go to the basic integrity of the nation, like decisions about war or what kind of war you're going to wage, I think more of us need to take responsibility for. But I think one of the things we need to recognize as citizens is our relative ignorance, not stupidity, but ignorance about really critical issues that require serious attention. And as long as I could, the problem is Americans don't trust, but if I could trust, I mean, one of Dennis's framing of what the problem of what I would call institutional corruption is if we don't have a reasonable basis for trusting that the judgment is being made considering the right factors, that's a corruption of the system. I think that's the type of problem that Richard's talking about, but eliminate that, and then I'm happy to offload many of these decisions to them.
Does anyone else wish to speak to that?
Well, these decisions about some of the most critical moral dilemmas may ultimately be made by people in a position of power, but they do respond to what they hear from ordinary people if we bother to make the effort to let our leaders know. And War and Peace is a good example. And almost always the right decision, yes, almost always is not to go to war. There are exceptions. And my grandfather was involved. He was living out in Westport, Connecticut back in the late 30s, early 40s, and wanted us to go in and do something about what was going on in Germany and to side with England in that war. And there were business interests. A lot of people in New York and elsewhere were on the other side of that, who invested a lot of money and a lot of deals going on with the big German companies and with the government there. And we went back and forth over that. Of course, years before I was born, my grandfather on the pro-war side, other people on the other side. And all I can say is I'm thankful President Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't hold properties over there in Europe, Berlin and Frankfurt, and have a revolving line of credit from Deutsche Bank for a couple $100 million. This is a serious situation when the public is so alienated that they don't get involved in these critical decisions about whether it's war and peace or global warming or whatever the other issues are. We need to get involved. And second, we cannot have politicians with such egregious conflicts of interest, whether it's our first and third presidents with the plantations or whether it's Donald Trump with properties over in, all over the world, wherever there's a dictator, there apparently want to be a Trump hotel. And this is a serious situation. You have countries that are moving from representative democracy toward authoritarian rule. That's what happened in Germany in the 1930s. This is a pattern. The President of the United States needs to be able to respond to that free of conflicts of interest. But we, the people, need to hold our government accountable. We also need to get involved in these issues. And that's our responsibility. We can't offload anything. We can't afford to offload, or we're not going to keep our democracy.
Yeah, right. Just don't presuppose that the people will be having no interests and will not be tilting the decision in their direction. This is a naive position. Usually when people intervene, it's the people with interest to intervene. And usually the people that intervene and have interest and have a voice are the people with some means to make their position. And therefore, when the people intervene, it's not necessarily for the best interest of the people, it's for the best interest of those who intervene. So it's very difficult to solve it by just allowing the people to voice their opinion. Both ways are more complicated than they seem.
More questions, please. Over here.
Yuli talked about how difficult it is to prepare anyone for the realities of office and also put some onus on the public for its expectations. And I think a little piece of this problem speaks to both of those, and that is there are very few people who think that experience in politics matters, that a career in politics matters. If you start out locally or in state legislatures, then you get some preparation for higher office. But we have, for a variety of reasons that we could explore, a public that thinks that governing is not something that you need experience or practice or preparation in. And as a result, we more and more get people who know nothings about that, leaving aside all of the other problems of values.
So I wonder whether there could be two reasons for that. One is a kind of know-nothing, like it's good to have people who don't know anything run for office. But the other could be that they just believe that the experience of being in government is a corrupting experience. That after you've spent 30 years, spending 30% of your time calling people to raise money, you just are not the sort of person who's going to be responsive. And that was certainly Trump's rhetoric in the campaign, right? It was, all of these guys are bought, I bought them. And this is why you shouldn't support them, because that's how they think. They think, what do I need to do to keep the people who've bought me happy? So I think if you removed that problem, or you eliminated the salience of that problem in people's minds, be more willing to think, it's a good thing that you've served in these three positions because we know that you have a better sense of how to move things through a parliament or a government.
I think it's very important to see politics as a profession. It's incredibly important because there's so many things you have to know, just even before the moral issues, just how to be, we didn't speak about being effective, just doing things that are working. It's not only about having good ideas or the moral ideas, it's about doing things. And a lot of people who come to politics without ever doing anything. I know I've been a minister twice. I was a minister of immigration in a very awkward way, just coming back from Harvard, going to the library, and Prime Minister Barack at the time needed a woman in the government, and a lefty woman. I was sort of I think there were two women that fitted the description. I was one of them. So I became a minister within about 2 hours. I knew nothing about it. I wasn't effective at all for the first, 6 months, because I really didn't understand, how it works. The next time I was a minister, it was after being 10 years in the parliament, serving in 5 committees, including the finance committee and the legislating committee. And I came into office and I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew how it is done, and I knew how to build coalition in the parliament to pass my reform, and I knew how to work with the Ministry of Finance, and I knew how to work with the Prime Minister, and I had no illusions about how things are in politics. And I was ready for the job, and it's very important to make, I understand your concern with money, but it is something that you have to be trained to do. Like, this is not a simple thing. Like when Trump said yesterday, hey, that's actually very, very time-consuming and difficult to be a president. It is. Even if, there are some presidents of colleges here, people know even that. Managing, it's about managing the system. And one of the things that we don't take into account is politics is not about making statements. It's about managing systems. And that needs a lot of experience. So one of the things, by the way, that we don't train, and Oxford used to do it in the good days. Oxford used to train people to go into public service because they understood it's a profession. This is lost, even at Oxford, unfortunately, though I'm now in the Blavatnik and they're all talking about better governance, but those people are all going to be head of corporations or something. They're not going to go into government. I think training people to go into government and then letting them grow within the system is incredibly important, and no one can get it in a day. I mean, if you walk into a ministry, even if you have the power, you can't really make a difference if you don't understand the system. And that's the bureaucratic part of it that is really left aside, also in what we teach in public policy. We don't teach how the bureaucracy works. I teach now at Blavatnik, and I say to my students, forget about ideas. Here is something you want to do. Tell me what you do next. And they don't have a clue. They have a vision, but you have to do something. No clue. And that's part of our pedagogical, I think, duty to teach people not only to make decisions and policies, is to implement things, is to work the system in the good sense of the word, to make it work. Because one of the things that happen is that we get a lot of decision and very little consequences on the ground.
I'm listening to this thinking this is the best advertisement ever for pursuing a degree at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I happen to be a senior lecturer there. It's a great institution where our focus is on just these things. Did you want to speak to this, Richard? Yeah.
Well, I think we see this with the president. He says, well, healthcare is complicated. Oh, okay. Well, I try to sort out what his view is on this. At one point, he was talking about a single-payer system being great a couple of years ago, and now he's endorsed whatever bill Congress will pass, even though he doesn't know what's in it, and I don't think half the members do, and we don't know what it'll cost and how many people lose their insurance. And then he turns to the Australian Prime Minister for Turnbull and tells him they got better health care than we do, which is probably true, and maybe they can mark up the Australian system and call it Ivanka care, and we could be done with the whole thing. I don't know. But, it is complicated policy. We have novices coming into government. Why are we in this situation? Well, I think the American people, one, are alienated from our government and the system, so they're going to take it out on career politicians. They're always going to look for a savior coming out of left field or right field or wherever, who may not be bringing the knowledge in. And then the second problem is the money. And I've talked to various political parties about what do you do if you want to run for Congress? Well, how much money do you have, and who do you got in your Rolodex is rich? This is going on in district after district in the United States, at least, that money is what you need to get in the door. And to the extent that is true, a lot of people say, well, I can't possibly run. I don't have the money, and I don't want to spend all my time calling rich people. I want to actually think about public policy, maybe actually figure out health care. So it's a challenge. If we don't change our campaign finance system, we're not going to have the quality people going into government and staying in government.
So we have a few more minutes and hopefully time for at least one more question. I see a few hands up, so maybe over here, or there's also one in the back. Actually, since let me see if we can get you in the back, and if we have time.
Then Francis is here.
Yeah,
Hi.
I don't know if we were going to have time to get all those. Yes, please.
We want your questions, Francis.
Hi, thanks. So my question is about whether there might be a tension between ethics in politics and compromise, which is that sometimes lack of compromise in politics seems to be due to partisan bickering, but sometimes it's because these people don't want to compromise on their deeply held ethical beliefs. And I wonder if by placing this demand on our politicians that they adhere to ethical decision-making, even when it's not popular, we make it very difficult for them to compromise. Unless, of course, we say that compromise is the highest ethical duty that a politician can aspire to, which itself seems complicated because then there's a tension between, well, there's definitely a right and a wrong thing to do outside of what compromise demands.
Who would like to start with that?
That's a really great question. I'm going to make a very practical way in which I think it manifests itself. One of the consequences of the way the House of Representatives has structured itself, with 90% of seats being safe seats, is that for candidates in those districts, the thing they're most afraid of is not a challenge by somebody, if they're a Republican, they're not worried about somebody who's a Democrat. They're worried about somebody who's an even more right-wing Republican. And the same thing in the Democratic district, somebody an even more. And the reason for that is the extremes are more energized to be engaged in a primary, and a primary is a low turnout event. So one way to describe that is they're afraid to compromise on their deeply held beliefs because they don't want to do the wrong thing. The other way to describe that is they don't want to do anything that gives the extreme in their district an excuse to run a campaign against them, to primary them. And I think that we should think about whether or how the way we structure the systems for electing and districting and gerrymandering make it harder for the process of governance to happen. I think one of the really valuable things about political parties that, of course, are eviscerated in the United States right now, but when you have a really effective political party that holds people together and can hold people together on the basis of ideas that cut across a whole bunch of lines, then it's easier to play to those policies rather than to have these games that are played in these particular districts. So it could be either the ethical or it could be the practical political, but the consequence, I think, is the same. It makes it harder to compromise.
Really quickly, do either of you want to speak to that as well? You're good?
I think it's a serious problem. The extremes, the way they take over and dominate. It's not anything worse than a primary. It's a caucus. We have the caucus in Minnesota, the Republican caucus, presidential caucus down in Iowa. That's a real circus, unless you're the far, right wing, 2% of the population. And of course, that's early on the presidential primary season. So we've got to do something to disempower the extreme right. And to the extent there is an extreme left in the United States, I don't think it's as influential. This is one thing I mentioned about the Russians. I mean, for years they're trying to subvert our government through the extreme left and the Communist Party and all that. They really weren't getting very far. They discovered the far right, and they've been having one heck of a party. It's a big problem.
So this gentleman here has his hand up, and I'm going to have this be the last question before we pivot to our simulation, which we do need to have time to do.
It just seemed that you were using the term entering government to represent two different things I think need to be distinguished a bit. And I was wondering, one is running for office, and the other is people who enter the bureaucracy, because those are very different paths. I assume that a lot of people at Oxford are entering the bureaucracy, not necessarily running for parliament. That would be
Both.
Both, but yeah. And it seems that the requirements and whatever are different in the American system anyway. To a fair degree, people in Washington are experts at winning elections, because that's what they have to do to a great degree. I talked recently with a Senate candidate and asked, did you really take half of your time dialing for dollars? And he laughed and said, if only it was only half. And then he talked about the difficulty of having to be an expert on everyone's issues when he had no time to actually learn about those issues. But the people in the bureaucracy do know about those issues, and I think we have to somehow think about the relationship of those two groups, because it's not realistic. Just as you in the cabinet are not going to be, in the Israeli system, are not going to be an expert in all the issues they're dealing with, and you're probably going to end up deferring on lots of things to things that are not education related. So it's the same actually with a lot of the politicians in Washington. We know that a lot of the good work is done by their aides who have the ability. So I was just wondering how that plays in thinking about this, the distinction there.
Right.
Well, so one really striking thing in America is the way we've privatized the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy is actually the system of lobbying that supports candidates and also supports the administration. And when you privatize the bureaucracy, obviously you change the character of who's going to be a bureaucrat. You make them richer, but you also make their focus not on the focus of a typical bureaucrat inside of a parliamentary system, perhaps, but a focus that's more directed to the private sector. And of course, this has been intentional since 1995. Congress has decimated, or parties in Congress have tried to decimate institutions inside of our policymaking body, whether it's the Office of Science and Technology or support for research for other members of Congress, that makes it so you can't have effective bureaucracy that's contributing to a conception of the public good for politicians. It's only this privatized side.
I think you're absolutely right. There is a division of labor between the bureaucracy and the elected representative. I think both should know some things that we're talking about the pedagogical aspects of governing. The division of labor is that the government has to deal with a wider range of issues than the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy should be more focused. Fortunately, in Israel, we don't have the funding issue that you have in the United States. There are other reasons why the bureaucracy doesn't work. But it's true that it's easier to allow the bureaucracy to focus and to get a lot of really sort of knowledge and experience in making decisions. And good ministers rely on their bureaucracy. But again, going back to what I said earlier, it is not very common that ministers or elected officials do really put their bureaucracy in front of them and allow them to govern. That's another important issue in order to get really good decision going and implemented. Here again, the tradition is that people talk about what they are doing, and they're very keen to say that this is their decision, and they're doing this and they're doing that. It's a very personal, politics became very personalized rather than systematic, and that's certainly a liability. But good bureaucrats, people who have been trained to do the work, can balance bad ministers and can support good ones, and that's a really important distinction.
Richard?
Well, the distinction between winning the election and governing that's something we're finding out right now, how sharp that distinction is. I mean, you have people like Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway. I didn't admire their tactics and so forth, but they figured out a way to win the election, or at least win the electoral college game. Yet governing is very, very different. You can say stuff right before an election and people will vote on based on fake news or whatever. But you start shoveling a lot of fake news on the White House lawn, and there's a little bit more of an extended discussion of what you said and what it means. You start talking about things like alternative facts or whatever it is, and it just looks ridiculous. So a lot of the people who are very good at winning elections aren't functioning very well in the government. And of course, the people who are the elected officials are going to be in the government. But one of our problems is they're bringing the people in to the White House or into Senate staff and congressional staff who are their campaign managers. And those talents, that skill set is very, very different, the governing skill set. And a lot of times it doesn't work. And Donald Trump's not the first example of that. We've seen that with other presidents as well.
Larry Lessig, Yuli Tamir, Richard Painter, thank you very, very much. All right, so we are pivoting immediately to the second part of this, which is a simulation. And what I want to do, and first of all, you should have a piece of paper in your folders which walks you through some of this, and I'm going to walk you through what's on that paper through some slides. I want to spend just a brief moment framing for you why we do this. And I think it speaks to what you just heard, or at least some of what you just heard this afternoon. So as someone who's been teaching ethics to policy students for many, many years now, one of the things that really interested me was pivoting to more case-based learning. And so I would give students a lot of cases, and they would read these cases, and there was much learning to be had, to be sure. But one thing that I noticed time and again was that students would often view themselves as if they were in the situation, they would have acted quite heroically. Right? And so, we would do some work with, well, here's the protagonist or the protagonists. What is their moral perspective? How are they approaching this? Many of you have encountered this kind of case-based learning before. But time and again, students would say, well, if I were in this situation, I wouldn't have done that. Of course I would. I would never have taken this compromise. I would never have overlooked this, and so forth and so on. And so I felt that some learning could be had by taking them up on the challenge, as it were, right? And designing a set of simulation exercises, short sometimes, longer other times, that would put them in a simulated situation and give them an opportunity to navigate it and see what they do. in these sorts of circumstances. You want it to be something that can be more or less rolled out in the course of one class or one review section, and then you can come back to it for another class to debrief it. You always have to debrief it, because otherwise it's just, here's this experience, wasn't that interesting. You want to hang on that experience some interesting moral principles, some concepts, and so forth. And what we've learned is that this really does seem to have a very powerful impact on students' learning of ethics. Among other things, it teaches them often something about themselves that they didn't know before, or at the minimum they weren't ready to maybe look at. What it also does is that it creates a kind of stickiness for their learning as well. In other words, they've gone through this experience, they've made their decisions, they've debriefed it with people, and they remember that experience. I have students come up to me at the end of the year who went through a very short simulation over the summer, like students, what we call at the Kennedy School mid-career students, and at graduation they're like, that thing you put us through this summer, like I'm still thinking about that. And that's a kind of stickiness to marvel at, as many of you know in education, because oftentimes you're just thrilled if they remember 3 sentences that you uttered over the course of a semester. So what these simulations tend to do is they tend to give folks an opportunity to practice some ethical reasoning in real time, to learn some interesting ethical concepts as well, and to hopefully take those lessons that they've learned and hold on to them more than they would before. And so what I'm going to have us go through now is a portion of a simulation that I've designed to help students think about some hard choices that they might have to face when working for an administration. This is part of a series of simulations that I've designed, that Tomer Perry has designed, that other folks are starting to design, that put students in a lot of different scenarios. So one simulation that we have called Liberty Hospital, students act as members of an ethics board, and they're faced with a crisis. There's been a horrible terrorist attack in the city, and they're having to make some very hard decisions on behalf of the hospital in terms of who to offer life-saving care to and who not to, how to divide up resources, and so forth and so on. Tomer has designed several simulations where it's ethical decisions in running for an election, both during the primaries and during the general election. Now, today's simulation is, hey, congratulations, you won, right? And you are in the Oval Office, but something terrible has happened. So what I'm going to ask you to do is you're going to be working with a couple of other people. So I'd like you right now to bring yourselves into groups of 3. You don't necessarily need to change chairs, but I want groups of 3 to form. And some of you may have to move for this. I've given exactly 1 minute for this, so please make it please make it as quickly as possible. I have no idea. I didn't even tell them to. Yeah, I don't care. Yeah. All right. Welcome to being a member of the administration. So you're a small group. You constitute the inner circle of advisors to the 46th President of the United States. Hurrah! You are going to be the 46th President of the United States, and here I'm going to be saying some things that are already captured in that piece of paper. The story here in the background is the 46th President of the United States won in a bit of a landslide as a response to the 45th President of the United States. She's a Democrat, and she gets to enjoy much what President Obama got to enjoy. She's come now into office with Democrats controlling both the House of Representatives and the Senate. But she's also inherited a world that's a little bit uglier than a couple of years ago. I'm saying it as a couple of years ago. Right? Tensions are strained globally, especially with China, and there's been some economic turmoil that's been caused by renegotiating some trade policies and so forth and so on. I'm not going to go through all the details of that. Fill in the blank with whatever dystopian vision you might have. I almost feel like I should ask Richard to do it because I think you can do better than anyone. But that's the idea. Fill in the blank. It's been 4 or 8 years, but happy days. This new president, a Democrat, also with a Democratic Congress, has come in. What you need to do in your group, first and foremost, and this is on your piece of paper, is something really simple, but you need to name your president. So please come up with a name for the 46th president of the United States. Name her, yeah, name her. Who is it? What's her name? May I have a sheet? Sheet. Can I have one? Yeah. No, you can come up with any name you want, but I'm actually going to learn a lot about you in about 30 seconds with the names that you've come up with. All right. Really quickly, we don't have time for everyone. There's some group or a couple groups want to share the name you've come up with. Yes?
Christopher Robichaud.
Oh, look at that. Hurrah!
Do that one better. Lawrence Lessig.
Oh, Lawrence Lessig. Second run. All right. Any others? Ivanka. Elizabeth. Right. Kidding aside, you do learn a lot, right? With things like just name the next president, or name your group, or name your organization. And what I'll be doing, just to let you know, is that part of this is to experience the exercise, but part of it is me jumping out of it and telling you what's going on during it. And we don't have as much time as in a whole class, but one thing that happens at a stage like this when I ask students to put things together, like one time I'll ask them to come up with a fake country. And they get to name the country, and they get to decide whether the country is a democracy or a monarchy or a dictatorship. And it's all a bunch of really simple questions, and I don't give them much time to do it, but there's some buy-in already when that happens. Now you have your 46th president, and you just named her. All right. So this is now an invitation for you to, on your page, distribute the following rankings across the 5 categories that are there. So you have 1 strong to use, 3 moderates to use, and 1 weak to use across these 5 categories. So what you're doing right now is I'm giving you an opportunity to sort of fictionally create the world you're inheriting and where things stand. I'm giving you some choices here. So the thought is, what is the current state of play with the United States' national defenses? How about its global standing in the world? How about your administration's relationship with its own party? How about the national popularity of the administration? How about the administration's capacity for policy craft and implementation? Right, these are features of anything, right? But often the world settles it for you. It's decided what it is. Here I'm giving you some opportunity to do it. So one of these I'm asking you to say strong. U.S.'s global standing, strong. 3 of these I want you to say moderate. We're moderate. We're not strong, we're not weak, we're moderate. And one of them I'm going to force you to say weak. This is a weakness of ours right now. So spend a couple minutes doing that, please. I can't answer questions. but if you have a question, please raise your hand and one of the staff will come around to answer a question. Thank you. You decide. You're deciding. You decide. Thirty more seconds, please. Ten seconds, and I'm going to ask us to share some of your decisions. All right. I'm going to just, I'm just going to ask about the strong category, right? So how many of you had national defenses as the strong category? Okay, how about you have global standing as the strong category? Arthur was asking me before, are we making a prediction? Or no, fair enough, right? How about the administration's relationship with its party? I mean, that'd be the strong category, okay? National popularity of the administration. Anyone choose that for strength, okay? And how about capacity for policy craft and implementation? All right, very good. There really isn't, and I'm not just saying this to make everyone feel good, there really isn't no right or wrong answer with this. This is just you're building in some facts about the world that you're entering into. And one of the interesting things that happens when folks do this is then when I throw certain things at you, and you look at what decisions you made, you say, oh, not because you were tricked. It's never that case. It's like, oh, this is a situation where it would have been good to have this, or, oh, we went in on this. But you don't complain, really. You just sort of groan because these were the decisions that you made. All right, now we have to figure out who you are in the administration. So we have a bunch of roles that you can pick, and before I ask you to pick them, I want to say that for the purposes of this simulation, there's two that I definitely want your group of three to pick, and then one I don't care who picks them, and then another one of your choice. So the thought here is that one of you can be involved with national security and expert on foreign and domestic security. These are not meant to correlate with any specific actual role, but more meant to be a tag onto someone who's an expert in this arena. You can be an expert in diplomacy, the statecraft, of party influence, a master party operative, public communications, a specialist in helping the president communicate our message, and a bureaucratic expertise, an expert in greasing the wheels to get things done. I was tempted to just give you the names of characters from the West Wing, and then to judge how many of you could just go from there. But instead, I gave you these. So for this simulation, you definitely want one of your three to be someone who knows about statecraft, and one of your three is someone who knows something about party influence, and then one of your three to be someone else of the three that are remaining. So spend some time talking to each other. Who do you want to be in this administration?
Only 3 of the 5.
Only, yeah, 2 of the 5 don't exist for this. Yeah, for this, yeah. All right, 30 more seconds, and then we're going to move on. All right. So, I want to just pause before we get now into the meat of this, because things can grind to a halt at this stage, and I don't want them to, right? I want to again pull back the curtain and explain why I came up with this particular simulation for students that I'm exposing you to today. There's going to be, shortly we're going to walk through a couple of things that you'll be doing in the half an hour that remains. For some scenarios that I give you, you'll have an opportunity as a group to advise the president. You're going to make a recommendation on a course of action. And for the purposes of our simulation, she's always going to adopt your recommendation, right? But another scenario, you're going to have an opportunity to comply or not comply. She's going to ask you to do something, and you're going to have to make a decision on whether you do it or you don't do it. The thing that I diagnosed at the Kennedy School that I found interesting was in many simulations in which the students had to work together, they actually worked together quite well. But what they were really not particularly good at doing is recognizing that in many professional contexts, you are often both collaborating and working together with people, but also negotiating your position amongst them. You know, it's never everyone holding hands and skipping off into the horizon together. It's always, well, sure, we're working together, but I want to be on top of this when we're done, right? Of course, it's not about people throwing each other under the bus, but it's more positioning, right? This is a reality, and people who go into service will tell you. When they come back, they'll say, you know, something I really thought we could have spent more time thinking about was not just, you know, all pursuing the good, but me thinking about my own position in this sort of thing, political survival, my skin in the game, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to devise a simulation that forced students into that space. And I'm just going to give you a very short taste of it now, but that's the thinking behind the simulation. It's not you're all working for the administration and you are all completely on the same page all the time about everything. So with that as the backdrop, let's talk about this first thing that you'll have an opportunity to do. I'll give you scenarios and you'll have an opportunity to advise the president, right? So the president's going to ask you, you're going to be given a scenario, and the president's going to come to you and say, all right, you know, I need a recommendation on this scenario. You're going to all, the three of you are going to deliberate together, but only one advisor, right, the relevant expert, and I'll tell you that per scenario, is going to be the one who makes the final recommendation. Only one of you is going to be the one making the final recommendation, but you're all supposed to deliberate together. All the other advisors will vote on the final recommendation that the person who gets to make the final recommendation is going to make. And if a majority of the group supports the decision, it has a greater chance of success. So roughly what this is supposed to look like is, here's a scenario. We already know who's going to be the person making this final decision, but everyone, let's talk about this a little bit. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And this person says, all right, here's what I think we ought to do. And the question is, do any of you support me in this decision that I'm going to recommend to the president?
Can they change their mind?
So the deliberative part is supposed to be like, all right, here's the scenario. Let's all talk about this. All right, I've thought about this. Here's what I'm going to recommend to the president, and now we decide whether we're going to support it or not. Now, here's the thing, and this, again, this is not going to really come into play much for what we do, but I wanted to show it to you. Right? Each advisor is going to get a check if a decision they supported succeeds, and an X if a decision they support fails. So this is some thinking that you have to go on. If you're the one making the final recommendation, you're on the line one way or the other. But the rest of you have this calculation that the game is inviting you to think about. The calculation being, well, do I want to go in on this because I think it's going to succeed? You know, I think it's a good idea. I might get a little check. I'll tell you what those things mean in a minute. Or do I want to? But I run the risk of it failing, and I'm gonna get hurt. Or I can just say, you know what? I'm not supporting this. You know, I don't want anything to do with this one. You're not going to get any bonus if it succeeds. You're not going to get any penalty if it fails. You're just staying this one out after you heard what the course is. And why you're staying out of it might be for a bunch of reasons. I leave that entirely up to you. But that's the thinking that's supposed to go on, and I'm trying to get students, when I give this to them, to think about, all right, let's deliberate about what we think the best recommendation is. Someone's going to have the final say on that. Would I be willing to support it or not when I have some stake in the outcome? Now, again, we're not going to be doing this, but these checks and X's aren't just abstractions. In a more complicated version of this, the more checks you have, the fewer X's you have, the more political capital you have to get the things that you want done in this government done. And so it really does matter strategically on whether you have a bunch of checkses or nothing or X's, because part of the simulation in the bigger version of it is to get you into a position where you not only help the president, but you help yourself accomplish your ends as well. All right, so that's the rough story about what it is to advise the president. And now here's the thought is that not all decisions succeed. So one thing that I really tried to incorporate into the simulations that I've designed is a little bit of randomness. The world is the world, right? And we're uncertain about how things are going to turn out. And so I do think that a lot of simulations that students go through, everything's determined already. But that's not how life is. And so I always want people to realize when they're going through simulations that the world can interrupt you and your best plans. And so that's represented by rolling some dice. Now, for our purposes here today, there's a couple of opportunities. I will direct you when the time comes to going online if you have a smartphone and having Google roll the die for you. But we do have some dice as well. I like having physical dice in my hand almost at all times. I think I have some in my pocket right now. And some of you are wondering, is that true or not? And I'm just not going to say. But this is meant to represent is, you come up with a recommendation, and then you got to see how the world turns out. So we've given you a chart, and the way for you to think your way through this here is, given the situation, if it's eventually going to be leaning on one of your strengths or weaknesses is going to determine how likely it is that the recommendation is going to succeed. If more of you supported it, the thought is it's more likely to succeed because there'll be more parts of the government sort of working together to get it done. That's a little bit of an abstraction. And I don't want to spend time with this at all because we're going to use it for like 10 seconds. But I just want to give you the idea of it. You would not believe in many simulations over a couple of hours how sacred that die becomes. Right? If people roll poorly for a group, they're never allowed to touch the die again. If people roll well, they are heroes and celebrated in the halls afterward. The die does some interesting stuff. All right, so we'll go through this. So something to keep in mind. You might say, well, okay, so what if a recommendation fails? Like, that's a bummer, but who cares? It actually matters. So here the thought is, this administration, your administration, sinks if you get 3 failed recommendations. If you roll poorly 3 times, it's 3 strikes and you're out. Any recommendation that follows counts as a strike against the administration. If the administration suffers 3 strikes, it implodes. Impeachment, resignation by the president. Once and only once, you can fall on the sword. And what that basically means is if you have gotten really unlucky, we're not going to get to this stage here, but if your administration has gotten really unlucky and you're facing 3 strikes, one of you can voluntarily say, I'm going to go out right now to the public and say this was all my doing, right? That's throwing yourself on the sword, and you buy your administration a little bit more life. But that has to be freely done. That can't be coercively done. There's no mechanics to do it. One person in this group has to say, I'm going to do this for the team. And that would be a fascinating thing to debrief on why you decided to do it. All right, that was all advising. And again, it's some heavy stuff. You don't need to know it all. I'll walk you through scenario by scenario. The only other thing you have to do here is complying. Sometimes you not have to make a recommendation. Sometimes the president is going to take you in that Oval Office and say, look, I need you to do this. This is what I need you to do. If a majority complies with the president gets her way. If no one complies, the administration just automatically gets a strike. If everyone says, yeah, no, not doing it. If less than a majority comply, then you have to roll to see if a strike happens or not. So in these sorts of things, the president's ideal is everyone agree? Yes, nod your head, fantastic. Right? The worst case scenario is everyone walking out of the room, as it were, and the middle ground here is some agree and some don't agree. All right. Complying with the president will give you a check. Refusal to comply gives you an X. There's no middle ground when it comes to compliance. Are you ready? All right. We have about 20 minutes or so. Let's see what happens here. So you're in your groups, you have your roles and all the rest of it. I'm going to go back to that one. So Tomer, who's standing up here in the back and who's helped me so much, Tomer, is going to read through the first scenario. And so I'm giving you him now. Can we... right.
1 month ago, the United States suffered the biggest cyber attack in its history. The entire power grid was down for 28 hours. It cost billions of dollars, and thousands of people lost their lives. So far, the investigation into who is behind the attack has been inconclusive. Some evidence points to China, and other evidence suggests China was made to look like it was behind the attack, and the attack may have had domestic origins instead. In the wake of this, an old bill, originally proposed but not passed in 2010, has resurfaced in Congress, the Protecting Cyberspace as a National Asset Act. Described by some as the Patriot Act of cyberspace, it includes, among other things, funding to develop an internet kill switch and language that would allow the president to throw the switch in the event of another major cyber attack. Proponents argue that such measures are necessary for national defense. Opponents argue that the bill gives the president an unchecked power to inhibit on our ability to communicate with each other, and that's an essential liberty. The bill has bipartisan supports and passes both chambers of Congress swiftly. However, it's not veto-proof, and by a slim majority, the American public does not support the bill, though opposition to it is not fervent. You must advise the president whether to sign the bill or veto it. Since a big part of the decision involves whether the president should buck her own party, which has pushed the bill through the House and Senate, the final recommendation will be given by the group's expert in party influence. Success and failure will be determined by the rank you have chosen for the administration's relationship with the party. If you advise the president to sign the bill into law, success means that she has gained political leverage for future legislation. Failure means that although she signed the bill, she wasn't able to leverage it into more political power for future legislation. If you advise the president not to sign the bill into law, success means that she has not compromised her political standing with her party, even though she bucked them. Failure will mean that her refusal to sign the bill made her powerful enemies within her own party. Good luck.
And this is a summary of that. There's been a major cyber attack, right? It caused a lot of harm. Inconclusive investigation says that China might be behind it. There's this Protecting Cyberspace as a National Asset Act, which gives a kill switch on the internet. The bill has bipartisan support, but isn't veto-proof and has been pushed by the president's party. Important thing is that a slim majority of the public is actually against this bill. So think about Obamacare. The slim majority of the public is a little bit after the Trump administration saying, do we really want the president to have this power? But both chambers of Congress are pushing it through. You must advise the president on the final recommendation. And so the party influence person will be doing this. All right, go to it. You have a few minutes. Start talking about what the recommendation should be. Sign this thing or veto it. So that's why I set you up to make sure that you chose a party. Did you not choose a party influence one? No, so I wanted someone here to be a party influencer, but one of you can take on that role for the purposes. Yeah, one of you should take on that role, right? Not the team, no. The checks and X's are really only on you. No, but that's the Till 3. Yeah. We'll do one more probably and then wrap it up. Just a few more minutes, please. May I have everyone's attention? I'm going to send you back into this in a second. I just want to make sure since it's new. So what should happen around now, hopefully there was a nice rich exchange. If this hasn't happened yet, the person who's in charge of partisan influence, you should now make a decision and announce it to the rest of your group. And in the next minute, the rest of you should think about whether you intend on supporting that or not. All right. Let us reconvene. So, as Tomer said to us in the video, this is just a rehearsal of the outcomes. If the recommendation ends up being sign the bill, success will mean that the president's gained political leverage for future legislation. If the recommendation is sign the bill and it's a failure, she wasn't able to leverage into more political power, even though she signs the bill. That's that. On the other side of it, if the choice is don't sign the bill, success means she's not compromised her political standing with her party, even though she bucked them. Failure means that she has made some powerful enemies within her own party. Done, done, done. Right. So what we need to decide now is whether you have succeeded or failed. So the first thing that you need to know is you know what your recommendation is. And you need to know if you have a majority of support for your recommendation. So in groups of 3, you just need one other person to have a majority support, right? And then you need to roll the die. So I'm going to ask you to look at your piece of paper now and look at the chart, because now it's going to matter. So if I can just have your attention for one thing, this is the only mechanical component to this. You want to be finding what rank you gave the administration's relationship to its party, right? That's either strong, moderate, or weak. Then you look at the chart, and that once you roll, you're going to see whether you're going to succeed or not. So what I ask you to do now is please, with a regular die or on your phone, to roll a 6-sided die and see if you've succeeded at your recommendation. Oh, I hear the moans and the celebrations already. All right, everyone. Can I just see how many groups succeeded, whatever the recommendation was? How many failed? Okay. How many groups recommended to sign the bill? How many said, no, don't sign the bill? All right, data. All right. In the interest of time, we're just going to do one more of these, not an advising, a complying. I want to show you what a complying one looks like. Now, as you see, what's that? You do not get a cyber attack yet, no, yet. But the scenarios unfold, right, and things happen along the way. And, if you were keeping track of checks and X's based on your successes or failures, you would know where your relative position in the administration was, how many resources you had, and on we go. Scenario 2. This is a compliance, not an advising. All right. A journalist claims to have confirmation from anonymous sources that the president was warned she should make cybersecurity a priority, but the president ignored the recommendation. There's no written record of the meeting, but you know it's true because you were all there. The president asks you to deny the story. If you are asked by anyone whether that was said in a meeting. To be clear, none of you have gone on public record yet about this. So none of you face a old school meet the press moment where you're like, oh, you just said like 3 months ago this happened, and then you said that. No, none of you have said anything about this yet. So you wouldn't be setting yourself up in that way for failure were you to do what the president wants. So the thought here is the president takes you into the Oval Office and says, look, if you're asked about this, if you're asked whether I said not to pay attention or to deprioritize cybersecurity a few months ago, I want you to say, I never said that. What's that? Now, there's no advisor on this one. This is something that you get to deliberate with together, but at the end of the day, we'll just ask, does a majority comply? Do all of you comply? Do none of you comply? That sort of thing. So start talking about this with yourselves, about whether you're going to do what the president has asked you to do. She said anything that could go out into the public, yeah. She says if you're asked in a way that could be made public to do this. So she's saying if you are asked, right, whether this was said, you deny it. What's that? No, she wants you to deny it. She wants you to deny it. Yeah. She wants you to deny that ever came up in the meeting. Yeah. So this was modeled after President Bush getting the 9/11 report. I mean the Al Qaeda report, like in August, right? Wasn't that sort of thing? And that was very. We all knew that happened. So, but I thought, well, what would happen if this was just a conversation, and then you're asked, hey, just say this never happened.
Right. The problem is that I think you deny it. Congress will have a hearing. They'll hold you in there under oath. And then the 3 of us in there under oath. One's going to check it out.
But here the thought is, there's no written record of it. It's only going to be hearsay, one person's word against another.
You've got to put yourself in a foreign perjury. Lying to the press is not a criminal. But to take the lie to the press,
then you have trouble, yeah. yeah, fair enough. I mean, I usually think this was more ridiculous, but then Sean Spicer, like the day after Trump became president, went out to the press and was like, no, all these people were at the inauguration. Like I couldn't believe what I was witnessing.
You lie about that. The problem is your party doesn't control the clubhouse of Congress.
Yeah, they will drag you in.
The press will be here the next day.
And that's why in this one part, the Democrats control everything.
Yeah. But they won't 2 years from now.
They won't. Right.
Oh, wait, just wait, though.
1 more minute, please. This is just a compliance, so there's no primary advisor. This is just. All right, it's time to make a decision. Let me remind you about compliance. Folks, if none of the three of you are going to do this, if all three of you say, I'm not going to deny it, then it's a strike against the administration. And again, if we were to continue this, that's where it goes. And the fiction there is, this is 6 months into her first term. I have more of the fiction. You know, she came in strong in terms of party, but was battered in the election cycle, and so this is going to hurt her. You know, this sort of thing is going to hurt her. So if none of you agree, it's an automatic strike against the administration. If all of you say, yeah, we'll do this, then you're done. Check. You know, she's fine. If it's mixed, then you need to roll the die again. So if some of you will do it and others won't, you need to roll a 6-sided die, and on a 1, 2, or 3, you get a strike against the administration. So for those of you where some but not all of you are complying, roll D6 again and see what happens. All right, we have 2 minutes, so let me wrap this up. First of all, it's confessional time. How many of you complied? How many of you did not comply? All right, there we go with that. 2 things, and then we wrap this up. I want to just give you a taste of this. The simulation itself goes on. There's more events, there's more things. There's a snowballing that happens. And then, of course, something that we don't get to do today is when you're done with it, you don't just end it and walk away. You then have a class or two where you debrief it, where you go around and ask people, all right, did you comply or didn't you comply? What were you thinking? What was the group thinking about that? How ought we think about this sort of question? And you do that for each scenario, and in that teaching moment, you get to introduce some concepts, you get to surface some moral principles, and you get to have students look at themselves a little bit and go, well, how did I think about this, and how should I have thought about this as you go forward? And that's what the simulation gives you a fertile ground to do. And we are done. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much.